Imagine 1947, New York, late evening. A demobilized army engineer named Jack Mullen lays two German tape recorders on the table, machines he literally carried from Germany to the United States in a suitcase because military command didn't really understand what he was transporting and simply waved him through. Mullen switches one of the machines on, places the head onto the tape, and a sound comes out of the speaker that makes the hair on his arms stand up. Not because it's frightening, because it's an orchestra, a live orchestra. Not hiss, not crackle, not the narrow horn of a gramophone squeezing music into a thin strip. Full, wide, breathing sound, as if the musicians are standing in the next room. At that moment, Mullen probably didn't realize he was holding more than just a war trophy. He was holding the trigger of a culture that would change how millions of people listened to music, furnished their living rooms, spent money, and argued themselves hoarse over whether there was an audible difference between copper and silver cables. And at the end of this story comes the moment when one man with a design education and a passion for sound achieved what engineers could not. He convinced ordinary people that good sound was not an eccentricity, but the norm. And that decision ultimately opened a market that Japanese companies would capture faster than anyone had time to comprehend. But to understand why any of this became possible at all, you first need to hear what the world sounded like before it. America of the 1920s and 1930s lived with sound that today would feel almost insulting to us. The horn gramophone, an icon of the era, reproduced frequencies roughly from 100 to 3,000 hertz, which meant everything below and above that range, while the human ear hears from 20 to 20,000 hertz, simply vanished. The bass disappeared, the air disappeared, the overtones that make a violin sound like a violin rather than a squealing toy disappeared. What remained was the silhouette of music, a sketch. Radio, which emerged in the 30s, was slightly better, but not by much. Technical limitations of transmitters and receivers cut away everything interesting. People listened to announcers' voices, news, jazz, and thought it was normal. There was nothing to compare it to. The only standard of quality remained live concerts, which not everyone attended and not very often. That is why the moment of realization, when it came, felt like such a physical shock. Someone would go to a live concert after years of gramophone listening and suddenly hear that a double bass had a body, that a trumpet had space around it, that applause sounded like applause rather than rain on a roof. And returning home, they would put on a record and think for the first time, this is not it, this is nothing like it. The Second World War did for audio technology what wars often do for technology in general. It gave it a push that peacetime would have taken decades to produce. In the late 30s, German engineers from AEG and BASF developed magnetic recording tape and magnetophone machines capable of recording sound at a quality absolutely unreachable for contemporary records. Frequency range from 50 to 15,000 hertz. Distortion less than 1%. Noise almost inaudible. When American troops entered Germany in 1945, Major Jack Mullen, an engineer by training, serving in communications, found himself in one of the studios where these machines stood. He understood what he was seeing. He took two machines and 50 reels of tape, brought them to the United States, and in 1946 he demonstrated them to the Institute of Radio Engineers in Hollywood, playing a recording of a symphony orchestra. The audience sat in silence for several seconds after the recording ended. Then came the kind of event that happens when the right person finds himself in the right place. Singer Bing Crosby hated live broadcasts. They chained him to a schedule, left no room for rehearsal, no chance to redo a failed segment. He was looking for a way to pre-record his shows. Mullen offered the magnetophone. Crosby agreed, and in 1947, his radio show became the first in American broadcasting to be recorded on magnetic tape. The quality was so good that listeners could not hear the difference between live broadcast and recording, but engineers could hear the difference between what had existed before and what had now become possible. After the war, hundreds of thousands of technically trained people returned home, hands accustomed to building things. Electronics specialists, radio operators, communications engineers, people who knew how to read schematics, solder, tune equipment. And many of them now possessed something else, knowledge of what sound could be. In garages and basements across New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, homemade amplifiers began to appear. Vacuum tube circuits, Western Electric, RCA, self-built constructions assembled from magazine schematics and parts bought at radio markets. People built speakers from plywood, calculated cabinet volume using formulas from technical handbooks, intentionally mistuned radio receivers to pull extra frequencies out of them. This was a culture that did not yet have a name, a community without a title. People exchanged letters, gathered in clubs, shared schematics. In a sense, it was a prototype of what would later emerge on audiophile internet forums, the same mixture of technical obsession, snobbery, and genuine passion for sound. James Lansing, one of the pioneers of loudspeaker design, spent these years experimenting with speaker constructions that would later become the foundation of an entire industry. His drivers captured low frequencies in a way no mass-produced product of the time could. He worked almost alone in a small workshop and died in 1949 without seeing the market his work helped create. Technically, the late 40s were a period of quiet revolution, one newspapers did not write about, but everyone inside it could feel. The range of reproduced frequencies expanded from 3,000 to 15,000 hertz. And those are not just numbers. It meant sound now contained overtones that had never been there before. A violin became a violin. Cymbals became cymbals. Harmonic distortion dropped from 10%, audible even to an untrained ear, to less than 1. Dynamic range grew. Sound stopped being flat. It gained quiet and loud passages, gained drama. Along with this emerged a question that still has no final answer and lies at the heart of every audiophile argument. How do you even measure sound quality? Engineers said with numbers, frequency response measurements, distortion coefficients, signal-to-noise ratio. If the numbers are good, then it's good. Others objected, I hear a difference between two amplifiers with identical measurements, which means the measurements are failing to capture something. This dispute shaped the entire subsequent culture of hi-fi. It split people into two camps that have never reconciled since. And it also created the foundation for marketing that would later sell people cables for thousands of dollars by appealing precisely to the idea that measurements aren't everything. In 1951, the first issue of High Fidelity magazine was published in the small town of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It was founded by Milton Lewis and John Curran, people who understood that this community had no voice. There was no place where people could systematically discuss what was good, what was bad, what new products had appeared, or how to understand the technology. There was technical chaos, a mass of DIY enthusiasts, and a handful of small commercial companies making components for those who understood why they needed them. The magazine changed that. Not immediately. The first issues were densely technical, written by engineers for engineers. But gradually, the editors found a different tone, accessible without being simplified, explaining technology through the listening experience, creating a language, a shared vocabulary for people who had previously described sound each in their own way. The term high fidelity had existed before, but it was the magazine that turned it into the name of a culture. Reading high fidelity meant belonging to a certain community of people who took music seriously. The advertising in the magazine became an accurate indicator of how the industry was being born. In the early issues, just a few small companies. A few years later, dozens of brands, each with its own philosophy, its own sound, its own audience. The magazine didn't merely reflect the market, it shaped it. A review in high fidelity could make a small company's reputation or bury it. Among all the people who tried to turn hi-fi into a business in the late 40s and early 50s, one man stood out because he didn't think like an engineer. Avery Fisher was educated in industrial design. He understood how things looked, how they fit into a space, what it meant to create an object you wanted to place in your living room instead of hiding in a closet. And at the same time, he was obsessed with sound. Since the 30s, he had been assembling components, experimenting, listening. He founded Fisher Electronics in 1937 in New York. It was one of the first companies to seriously approach hi-fi as a product for the market rather than a hobby project. But what distinguished Fisher from most competitors was design. Fisher tubed amplifiers looked elegant enough to place proudly beside a bookshelf. They were finished with wood and metal. They were beautiful. That may sound trivial, but in the context of that era, it was revolutionary. Most audio enthusiasts viewed aesthetics with suspicion. Real sound mattered more than appearance. A beautiful enclosure was a concession to housewives' tastes rather than serious audio. Beautiful sound and a beautiful object are not a contradiction. They are one and the same. That argument opened hi-fi to people who had never considered themselves audiophiles before. Not engineers with soldering irons, but people who simply wanted good music in a beautiful interior. The market immediately expanded. H. Scott, Ico, Dynaco, companies with similar philosophies followed Fisher's lead. While enthusiasts were building amplifiers and High Fidelity magazine was shaping the language of the new culture, two more events occurred that transformed hi-fi from a hobby into a mass phenomenon. In 1948, Columbia Records released the first long-playing record, the LP, 33 revolutions per minute instead of 78. One side could hold up to 25 minutes of music instead of 4 under the old standard. Sound quality improved, hiss became quieter, an entire symphony could fit onto one record. RCA Victor responded with the 45 RPM record, a small single, convenient for radio and jukeboxes. A format war began, lasting several years and ending in compromise. LPs for albums, 45s for singles. But the side effect of this war was that people started thinking about playback quality. They bought new turntables, compared styli, argued over which format sounded better. And then, in 1958, stereo arrived. This was perhaps the most physically tangible moment in the entire history of hi-fi. Stereo recording. 2 channels, 2 sound sources created space. Music no longer came from a single point. Violins appeared on the left, cellos on the right, the soloist in the center. It was like the difference between a photograph and a 3-dimensional model. People hearing stereo for the first time in a store or at a friend's house described it almost physiologically. Goosebumps, a sense of presence, an inability to believe it was a recording rather than live musicians. By the end of the 50s, hi-fi had ceased to be the language of garage engineers. It had become a culture. Magazines, stores, clubs, debates, and a huge market only beginning to realize its scale. And it was precisely at that moment that Japanese companies appeared on the horizon, watching everything that was happening with professional interest. Sony, Trio, Luxman, they saw an American market that already knew what it wanted and was willing to pay for it. They saw a culture with its own language, its own press, its own community. They saw companies like Fisher that had made hi-fi respectable, and they were thinking about how to make it accessible. Avery Fisher sold his company in 1969 to the Japanese conglomerate Sanyo. To many, it seemed like a strange deal, the market pioneer stepping aside for those he himself had inspired. But Fisher seemed to understand exactly what he was doing. He took the money from the sale and donated a significant portion toward building a new concert hall at Lincoln Center in New York. The hall was named after him, Avery Fisher Hall. The man who spent his entire life trying to bring the living sound of the concert hall into the living room ultimately built a real concert hall. It wasn't irony, it was the completion of an idea. The history of hi-fi is the story of what happens when several people simultaneously realize that what exists is worse than what could exist. Jack Mullen with a German tape recorder in a suitcase, enthusiasts in garages with soldering irons and manuals, magazine editors in Pittsfield deciding that this culture deserved a voice, Avery Fisher deciding that beauty and quality are not opposites. Each of them alone would have been a curiosity. Together, they created a market, a culture, and a standard that still lives on in every person who once heard the difference and could never forget it. Did your home ever have any equipment from that era? An old tube amplifier, a vinyl turntable, the first speakers? Or maybe you're still convinced that vinyl sounds better than digital? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.